Welcome to the Boss Lady Coaching Podcast. And we are happy to be back with Jerry Mraz. I'm Hollie Sexton, and Megan Stith is here with me as well, of course. And this Boss Lady production is also on YouTube for your convenience. And today we're talking about job interviews. And Jerry Mraz has done his homework and he is back sharing his skills and wisdom. And so this is a masterclass of sorts on job interviews. So we're so happy to welcome you back. Jerry, good to see you. Megan, always good to see you. I miss seeing you in person. And maybe one day again.
We'll wait for those vaccines. It'll happen eventually.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it. And we didn't drive Jerry away. He is back to share more of his wisdom with job interviews. And if you're watching and you missed his first interview with us, we went in depth with resume writing. So these are free classes, if you will, master classes, as I mentioned. That's trademarked, by the way. So this is the Boss Lady production of job interviews with Jerry. So Jerry, welcome. And how do we get started in this transition from resume success to actually getting the job? And we know the word starts with a P, it's preparation. So welcome back, Jerry, and let's get started with preparing for the job interview. So we'll just seamlessly blend from the resume into interviewing.
Absolutely, and we have to remember the resume. And the resume is we just moved down the process a little bit, the process map a little bit further. The resume tells who you are. It gives you a chance at self-assessment. You do some job seeking. We talked about all that in fairly great detail. In some respects, the purpose of the resume is just to open the door to get you an interview. There are many hiring managers out there. I was one of them. Quite frankly, the interview was the big thing. And oftentimes you'll hear stories told by hiring officials, hiring managers, who will tell you, the person I saw on the resume looked like this, but the person that came for the interview, I had a hard time believing they were even the same individual. And not a good trap to fall into. And I think we can talk about some of that. You're right, it starts with preparation. And the one thing I try to, I've had a number of people come to me and talk about job search and hunting and resumes and interviews. Relax, just relax. At every step of the process, take a deep breath. There is probably nothing more stressful than interviewing. I don't know that one ever gets to be a skilled interviewee, but there are things you can do that will help take some of that edge off. Be yourself. That's probably one of the, and that's kind of cliche. And today's podcast may be filled with a lot of cliches. Just be yourself. I've heard stories. I've seen people that kind of want to come into a job interview. They're very anxious to get the job and they want to reinvent themselves. Not the place and time to do that. That's going to throw you out of sync with your resume. The resume is a little bit of a word picture of who you are. Make sure that word picture of who you are matches who you really are when you show up, be it in person or in a situation like this where it's online. You want to be confident and be polite. All those good things that mom told you. Say please and thank you and yes sir, yes ma'am, no sir. Don't put it on too thick, but be polite. And when in the confidence thing, don't put that on too strongly either, because you can very easily slip over into the realm of being kind of cocky and sort of a know-it-all, and that's definitely not something that you want to be labeled as.
Like for instance, you're doing them a favor by granting you your time or granting them your time to do the interview.
Yeah, exactly.
Probably too much.
Or looking at your watch saying, I've got really important stuff to do if we can kind of move this along. Probably wouldn't. It might be memorable, but not the way you want to be remembered. Then there's some other things we can talk about for preparation. Make sure that you know the details of the job that you've applied for. Look at that job announcement. Make sure you know what that is. In most cases, people aren't just applying for one job at a time. It's not at all uncommon that you may have 2 or 3 interviews that line up fairly close to one another. Make sure that you're real familiar with the interview that you're going into, that you're familiar with the position that it's for. Very embarrassing situation happened with a candidate that we had. The person walked in and another organization, another element within our organization was hiring at about the same time. They had applied for a job with them and with me, and they got them confused. And when they walked in, it was very awkward for the first couple of questions because they weren't sure where they were. So avoid that kind of thing. Know your own resume. And that may sound a little odd, but the more time you spend in the workforce, the deeper your resume is going to be. Make sure you familiarize yourself with those dates and things. And it's one of those that when you find yourself in a stressful situation, those people of my generation, we were talking about generational things earlier. We have those forgetful moments. Happens to everybody, and don't get tripped up on, where you went to school and when you graduated and what certificate you got and when you worked at a particular place. It doesn't hurt. It doesn't take long just to kind of, peruse your own resume very shortly before you walk into an interview. Nowadays, we have the advantage of having a great amount of information available to us at our fingertips, on our phones, on computers, on iPads. Take time to learn what you can about the organization you've applied to. What are their strategic goals? What's their vision and mission statement? If it's in the business world, it's not a bad idea to look up, where do they sit financially? How long have they been around? You can get a lot of good information. It gives you a feel for who that organization is, what kind of culture they have, what kind of people they might be looking for.
So in this interview, is it a good time to ask about salary?
My recommendation is no. Now, I will tell you that I must qualify this, that I come from the government sector, and in the government sector, we don't talk salary at all. That's done by the HR people completely. We tend to have set salary scales and schedules. So that's an area that I'm not as well versed in, but the research I've done tends to tell me you may want to have a salary number in your head, but at the interview is not the time to talk about it. That's going to follow on. The details of what are benefits, salary, all that basic kind of detail in a job is not done by the hiring manager. The hiring manager is concerned about you coming to work, you fitting on that particular team that they have, your ability to contribute there.
Thank you for answering that question. Is it appropriate at that time as well to ask when they'll be in contact with you or when the hire will actually take place for the position you interviewed for?
That's a good question. Oftentimes, most interviewers will they get to the end of their questions and almost always will say, "Now, do you have any questions for us?" And that's a good question to ask during that, when it's your turn to ask questions. When do you anticipate filling that sort of a thing? But I wouldn't be pushy about that. They kind of work on their own time schedule. Maybe better people to ask that of is not necessarily the hiring manager. If it's a larger organization at all, it's going to be their HR department who kind of drives that train in terms of when they onboard people. Smaller organizations, the hiring manager may be the person that does that kind of thing. So that's certainly fair game to ask them at that point in time. Which, when we talk about preparation and think about that end of the interview question where you get to ask questions, give some thought to that before you go in there. Don't try to wing that. Spend some time, and again, if you've taken some time to do a little research on the organization, that's a good time to ask specifics about the position. Is this a new position? How long has it been on your organization table? Is the person, has it been vacated? Is there a gap? Those sorts of things are first of all, it shows, I think it demonstrates the candidate has paid enough attention to you, the prospective employer, that's going to get you some points, I think, when you ask thoughtful kinds of questions.
Well, speaking of researching the employer, which I think is a great idea, some interviews are taking place on Zoom or over the phone or other platforms. So we know when we're going in person, we need to research it before and know how to get there so we're not late and plan our route and that type of thing. But what about etiquette for interviews on Zoom?
That's a good question, a question that many candidates that I've spoken with will ask that. And my general advice is you treat that Zoom interview, that teleconference interview, the FaceTime interview, and I've interviewed people on VTCs, the video teleconferences, folks who've been overseas. We've used government systems. We use FaceTime. Zoom wasn't popular at the time before I left. I would sit down and prep. I sat down and prepped for this podcast as if the three of us were going to be in the room together. And I would recommend, when it comes time for a job interview, dress up, dress the way you're going to dress, make sure you have good posture, pay attention to what's on the wall behind you, pay attention to things that are going on.
Okay.
We've
Yeah.
the cat lawyer and all that kind of stuff that goes on. But those things happen. And again, it's an attention to detail thing, and it could be an attention to detail flag for a prospective employer. It's like, you mean you didn't take enough time to realize that your window's open and there's a train running by all the time, or whatever.
Yeah, and I think too, checking and making sure your devices are working as well as possible. We can only control the internet to a fault,
yeah,
or Wi-Fi, but yes, absolutely making sure that we're in a good place to do that. And
take the filters off your things.
Yes, Meg's like, I'm not a cat. I had an interview a couple of weeks ago with a client, and it was one of those situations where I put the background in, and I couldn't figure out how to get it off. So I ended up doing the interview. But at the beginning, I just said, I don't know how to fix it. But thankfully, I wasn't a cat. But yes, it's one of those situations where you want to just back out of the room, but you can't because it's digital. You're like, I'll be right back. No, there was none of that. I just had to conduct it that way. So it was a little embarrassing, but fortunately, everyone was graceful and forgiving. But you're right. I think in this situation with an interview, it's definitely a whole different story with professionalism.
It is. And I did something just a moment ago that reminded me. I picked up my coffee cup and I took a drink of coffee, and it brought to mind an interview that I did back when I was in Washington, D.C. After hadn't been a civilian too terribly long. We were conducting an interview, and it happened to be an internal candidate to a fairly large organization that I was a part of. Individual came in, sat down, set their Starbucks cup right in front of set it right in front of the desk where we were sitting, and said, "Okay, guess we can start now." And I thought, okay. You want to be poised and confident, but don't get too familiar with the people doing the interview. Don't just walk in like it's another day and you're going to sit down and chit chat with them or whatever. So there's definitely a balance that one needs to strike.
That reminds me of some interviews I've seen on Saturday Night Live. You know what I mean? Very relaxed.
Yes.
So speaking of that, what do we wear? What do we wear for interviews? Not a tiara, I'm assuming.
This hoodie, right?
This hoodie, yes. Let's put our hoodies on.
Your hoodie's nice. Mine, camo, probably not.
Hey, I could go for some camo.
I think an interview, this is one of those times that, and as we before we started the recording of the broadcast here, we were talking a little bit about generational differences. And I think it's good to be aware of that. You need to, if you can recon who's going to be sitting across from you at the table, who is going to be conducting the interview. I'm a boomer, okay? So when you ask me the question of what to wear, my expectation is you need to dress up just a little bit to come to an interview. Now, I interviewed for, I'd say the warehouse guys at my last organization worked for me. The warehouse guys wear Carhartts and jeans and t-shirts, and that's what they wear. I certainly don't want them wearing a necktie because that's dangerous in the kind of work that they do around forklifts and such. But when it came time to interview for a vacant position down there, every person who came dressed as if they were going to go work in the outer office. they had all dressed up. Now, I would not at any point in time expect them to dress like that coming to that job that they were applying for. But it was clear to me that without it, somebody, I don't know if anybody told them or they just kind of assumed this, that if I'm going to go speak to somebody who is going to be my boss potentially, or even senior to that, that you dress up a little bit. Don't go walking in with, a tuxedo and an evening gown or anything, but
that's my MO. It's who I am.
It's a regular Tuesday for you.
The parasol and the gloves.
Yes, and the fan and the gloves and all that.
But you kind of want to dress. You want to dress the way and act the way the people that you're going to work for. Dress and act like your boss if you want your boss's job one day. And it begins at the interview process, I think. Now, this is probably, gosh, this topic of interviews, if there's one that's subject to a lot of opinion and not a lot of fact, it could be this topic. There may be people that come in and contradict a lot of what I'm saying. But I think generally speaking, dress up, step your game up just a little bit.
And I think this is where researching the culture of where you're going to interview, that may come into play there as well. So, but I think we can safely say maybe stay away from jeans and t-shirts and just elevate a little bit if you're uncertain. There's something in your notes that I really want to, I'm just going to be real about it. When I get nervous, as both of you know, because you've done many podcasts with me, when I get nervous, I just go in circles. So in your notes, it talks about going down a rabbit hole. I can go straight down a rabbit hole when I get nervous. So are there any tips for that, Megan or Jerry? Do you have any tips to help people like me who do that? We're happy to be there. We want you to like us and we just keep going. So how do we shut up?
Megan, she needs help. Throw her a line.
Need help shutting up. See, I'm doing it now.
I'm the least qualified to answer that one because I can have that tendency too of thinking out loud. So I'm, sometimes kind of know what I'm trying to get at, but I need to kind of go through I'm telling you this to tell you this. So I guess for me, if I know I'm prone to that, I prep a lot for interviews, and especially I usually come in with some kind of portfolio, and I'd love to talk more about your opinions on that too, Jerry, of do you show work examples, or do you show something that can really attest to not just your own opinion of your skills but other evidence. So that's where a lot of my prep work, it's intended to make sure I'm staying focused and I know what examples I want to point to. I know what points I want to make, so that I'm less likely to chase the rabbit. So doesn't mean it's impossible to happen, but I find a lot of confidence and calm in that preparation process. So I know by the time I hit that door, I know typically what I'm going to say to just about they could throw a gotcha question, but typically the majority of questions I've probably thought about and figured out some type of response in advance.
So rehearsing.
Yes, not necessarily scripting, because you also don't want it to be like they ask you a question and you're like, I'm going to give you this totally different response to something you didn't actually ask me because this is what I want to say. Media training, we're like, I'm not going to answer that, but I'll tell you what I want to say. So you don't want to be kind of stiff or too rehearsed or scripted, but definitely, if it helps to do a mock interview, that could be a helpful technique to give you some practice. And that's why I think any interview is just good experience, because it makes you more comfortable in those settings. So if you have opportunities, to get more interviews or to get mock interview practice, I think being able to think of the times when I've gone down rabbit holes is when I'm trying to think of an example and not just saying, oh yeah, I'm really good, or I have this trait, but I'm trying to think of a time or a situation or a scenario. And if I've kind of outlined that in advance and I know here are a couple, cases or examples that can play in a few different situations, then I'm less likely to try to be coming up with something off the top of my head, and who knows where that could end up without too much forethought.
Yes, absolutely. I can.
A long answer, hopefully not too long, too many rat holes in that one.
Well, we all know each
not
other.
going to ask for that.
No, we're familiar. We can definitely get there. And that's one of the tips that Jerry had, was to share some stories and have them filed away for ready recall in situations like that, which I think is a really good tip. And what I think that can do as well is it can show beyond our resume more about our personality and what we're passionate about. But I don't want to skip over this next part. I just want to hit some high points on it because there's so much we want to talk about here. But the basics in the interview, Jerry talks about posture, eye contact, speaking clearly, not using jargon, slang, or profanity. No name dropping, make it about you yourself and not who you know. And this was really interesting too. Paper and pen. I take notes like a court reporter. So I didn't think about asking if note taking is permissible. So Jerry, is that a thing?
It should be a thing. It's not. I don't know that somebody conducting an interview, most people who are conducting the interview are going to be polite, just as the candidate's going to be polite. They may not like to have the thought that somebody's recording the questions because they may be shared with other candidates or whatever, who knows? I mean, and it could be an organizational, cultural kinds of thing. To me, that falls in that bucket of being polite. And I would encourage people, take a small notebook and a pen. Don't be taking notes on your phone, even if you're a very fast typer. But take a pen and a little pad of paper, but ask right up front, is it okay if I jot down a few notes before we have the interview? In some ways, again, to me, there are a lot of different little subtle signals that as a candidate you can transmit during the course of an interview. One of those is attention to detail. Gosh, I got schooled a long time ago by a wise old NCO who always said, you will have a note card and a pen or a pencil every time you come to see me, because if I'm going to give you a mission, I want to know you're taking notes. I don't want you walking out 5 minutes later going, now, what was it he said? I don't really remember that, or getting it wrong. Questions in interviews, you're stressed. And if somebody hits you with one of those famous 3-part questions and you're answering part 1 and part 2, and I don't remember what part 3 is, or if there was a part 3, it's nice just to be able to jot a few things down. And most interviewing officials don't mind that, because guess what? I get a higher quality question or a higher quality answer if you've taken a few notes and you remember what the question is, rather than you're given some sort of an answer that's like, I'm not quite sure where you're going with that one. In fact, I will give you this example, because we have to remember this. There's 2 parties to this whole process. There's the person being interviewed, and there's people who are interviewing. And for those, when I had an opportunity, it didn't happen a lot, that we would have candidates who were actually all going to be physically present. It seemed that oftentimes we'd have candidates overseas or outside the state. So we do at least some telephone or video interviews. But if I had candidates who were all going to come in person for the interview, I would give them a time and build in an extra 15 minutes on my time. They would come, I would greet them. Hi, how you doing? I'd hand them a copy of the questions. And I'd say, here are the questions for the interview. Why don't you take about the next 15 minutes and read through these and get comfortable with them. I'm going to ask for that paper back, please, before you come sit down. And I'm going to tell you, when I did that, I had a lot of hiring managers look at me like, are you crazy? It's like, hey, I'm not trying to conduct a pop quiz. I don't want to ambush somebody. I want good answers. What I would find is the stress level in the candidate would drop dramatically. The quality of answers and responses that I got to questions would increase greatly. Again, I mention that because it's similar to the note-taking thing. If you need to write down a question, I shouldn't be concerned about that. Equally, if I hire you and you're working with me on something, I want you to take down notes. And if you have a question, you need to ask, and that will help.
I wish every hiring manager on the planet could hear what you just said. And just knowing and feeling confident can make a huge difference. And you're right. You realized that you weren't helping them cheat. You were helping them feel more comfortable so they could be themselves, which is brilliant.
It helps a great deal. It helps both parties in the equation when you do that, I think.
done the same thing with that wasn't kind of a standard practice, and now having done it in a few different settings and seeing, you see the candidates like they take this breath of, oh gosh, that's one less thing I have to worry about. I probably would never go back now at this point to it's just such a courtesy, and it's something that we're printing anyways. Might as well have an extra copy, just so, especially those ones that might have a couple questions within the question, it can just be there for them to reference. We're not taking it with them. I'm not really sure what the downside is to that approach. It seems like it really puts everyone more at ease.
I love that. I've never experienced that in an interview, so that's exciting that that's happening. So we can think about questions that are pretty typical that we've been asked in interviews, or that we would be prepared to answer, and it's on most documents, or it's even on LinkedIn. Like, tell me about your hobbies. What do you like to do in your spare time? That type of thing. And questions that we can anticipate. What are some questions? And if Megan, you'll take one, and Jerry, you'll take one, or share an example of one, a question that may throw someone off that they don't expect in a professional setting like that. Pop quiz.
Okay, you want me, who's going first, or does it matter?
Go for it, Jerry.
Jerry, go ahead.
I jumped up first, I guess. I will tell you a question I used a number of times in interviews with people at mid-grade to senior grade levels. We'd be plugging along, and they had done their homework, and they knew the job they were applying for, so they were anticipating the questions. And oftentimes there'd be 2 or 3 of us asking questions, and we each take a turn. It would come my turn to ask a question. I'd look at the candidate and I'd say, tell me the last book that you read, and what kind of an impact did that have? What did you get from that? How did that change your life? I'm going to tell you what, you want to talk about scaring people. I saw jaws drop. I saw eyes pop wide open. They were ready to tell me about, whatever systems we were using, or if it was, when I worked in an intelligence agency, they were going to talk about all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, what book did I read? Where did that come from? And here's the thing. I don't care what book they read. I don't know what book they read. That question was designed purposely to throw them off guard. And I want to get an elevator speech from you that makes some kind of sense. You could tell me that you just read the latest, you read something from Dr. Seuss, and this is how it applied to you, or you read something on neurobiology. Give me an answer, make it concise, make it impactful. This is, stay on target. This is what I read this book. This is basically what it said, and this is what it meant to me. That's the answer. Is just that simple. But it was quick. It didn't catch them. And in a lot of situations, I especially like to use that with senior people, because we would find ourselves in a situation to give what we would call an elevator speech. You got 3 minutes with the general. Make your point, make your case. Well, you better be on your toes for those kind of opportunities, because you may not be prepared when it comes up. So that's my story.
That's a great question. And I'm thinking of one that might not necessarily be, kind of leave somebody kind of grasping for an answer, but it's a question that I feel is really important. And it's about asking for a description of a time you had to share bad news with somebody and how you handled it. Because especially in my world, I'm just a professional at getting rejected, I guess. Sometimes, I'm the one personally that's getting the bad news. Maybe a grant we wrote didn't get funded. And you've got to tell people who spent a lot of time and effort. You're just not always going to have the celebrations. And I think in leadership roles, especially, understanding how someone approaches disappointment, rejection. I always have questions too about how do you handle rejection, not just specifically like, can you handle it, but like, tell me about how you cope with with being rejected, or tell me about a time you've been rejected and how you handled it. And again, some of these are kind of related to scenario like fundraising, where that's just kind of part of the job, and you want to make sure that sometimes people have an opinion of a position where you're looking at it from the outside, like, oh, that sounds so rewarding, and that sounds, you're getting to help people, and you're getting to, in my case, I get to see amazing stories about how students are helped because of donations. But sometimes if you're not really familiar with the field, you don't realize some of the challenges that can come with it. So usually those questions are looking for someone to help really show that they get that there's the very rewarding, very meaningful side of the work, but there also is this resilience that you need to be able to come do it day after day when not everything's gonna, it's not $1 million gifts every day. There's that type of persistence that you need. So I think especially for positions like sales, anything customer service facing, understanding how someone handles those not so great situations is really helpful for me as an employer.
Those were two fantastic examples. I'm taking notes in my head, but I wanted to be in the moment and hear every single word you two said about that. So that is super helpful. So before we move on to the actual like interviewing by phone and time management and following up after an interview, let's talk briefly about questions that may be out of bounds. So this is a portion that benefits the interviewee, the job seeker, about knowing their rights. And this can also tell us a lot about an employer. So what are some questions that are out of bounds?
In the federal government, it was almost a manual. The thing was thick of all the things you could not ask and why, and it had court cases citing that, which the reason that you can't ask certain questions is I can about guarantee that means somebody got sued multiple times along the road for asking those kind of questions. But really, when you get right down to it, employers cheat themselves oftentimes by having some underlying prejudice about particular types of candidate. Fill in what you want for type, be it gender or sexual orientation or race or whatever. So any of those kind of questions that deal with race, gender, sexual orientation, health conditions, politics, religion, all off the table. You cannot ask those kind of questions. You can't, and it gets to the point that I'm not allowed to ask. I mean, if a candidate comes to sit in front of me and they may appear to be pregnant, I'm not allowed to ask, so when do you do? That's forbidden.
Always a bad idea. Always. That's so bad.
Unless someone is in labor in front of you and you have to catch a baby, do not ask, is my motto.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly.
Oh, what about marital status?
Marital status is one that's definitely not. That's
age.
Age. And you may come in, you may find somebody who's been highlighting their hair with a little bit of gray. Yeah, those are all questions you can't ask. Again, back to the other side of the table for those people who are interviewing, and I have had this happen, where a candidate will disclose information along those lines. I didn't ask. They mentioned something about that, or they say that. I always coach the folks in the interview panels and my hiring managers. That's when you just put your pen down, just smile and nod or whatever. Don't write that stuff down if the candidate inadvertently discloses that kind of information. You may find, we would find also for the person doing an interview, religion's one of those areas that's really an off limits kind of topic. However, if a candidate is asked a question about, give me an example of a time when you ran a project from start to finish, you planned this thing, you got funding for it, brought people together, executed the plan, and then did an after action. Give us an example of that. The person may say, well, there was this time because, I'm a member of fill in the blank church, and I was on the committee and we did this, and they walk you through the answer. And what I would always and honestly, that there's people who work in the world of volunteers. Trust me, that's a great skill that you want to take credit for. But for the people conducting the interview, I would always coach them, just don't write down the, Elizabethtown Baptist Church of Mulberry Avenue or whatever. Just leave that part blank. Their organization did this or that. It's kind of a touchy topic, but it's one of those where there are situations where people who have done volunteer kinds of work may have worked in an organization that might be kind of on the boundary of those out of bounds questions. So it can be handled gracefully, I guess.
Got it. And don't write it down. Good tip. Thank you so much for that. So what if someone feels uncomfortable in an interview with when they're asked a question? Should they answer the question? Should they get up and leave? What should they do in that situation?
I think it's one of the, in my opinion, it's one of those that's you kind of have to make a judgment on the spot. If it's not too far across the bounds, maybe you can answer the question and be vague about your answer. If it's truly an out of bounds kind of question, it's probably not wrong at that point just to say, I'm not really comfortable answering that question at this time. Now, you may be sitting there thinking, well, this is over. I'm done because I refuse to answer. But it tells me as a candidate, if I have an organization that's going to ask those kinds of inappropriate, out of bounds, unlawful questions in the course of an interview, do I really want to work there? It gives me a little window into the culture of that organization, and that can be valuable.
Thank you for answering that, because I think it can say a lot about an organization, and it can save the person, the candidate, it can save them time as well. It's kind of like a bad date, you know? You walk away and go, wow, I wish we'd just had drinks and left it at that. I wish we hadn't gone on and spent an hour at dinner together. My goodness. So let's talk about time management, and then we'll finish up with follow-up. Time management during an interview.
Most interviewers operate on the assumption that every candidate is going to get an equal amount of time. Maybe I have 30 minutes per candidate, 45 minutes per candidate, an hour. Rarely does it go over an hour unless it's some highly technical kind of thing. A lot of hiring managers will give a clue at the front end of an interview. I would always remind candidates, hi, glad you're here, la-di-da. We're going to take about 45 minutes. And I have questions to go through. We have, and oftentimes I would tell them how many. I have about 45 minutes to conduct this interview, and we've got about 7 questions we're going to ask you today. I'm throwing you a line here. I just told you how long it's going to be and how many questions. Time to do some quick math. Most interviewers aren't going to set a little chess timer on the table and go, okay, answer, and tick, 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 and you get to watch. When, okay, it's time, I gotta wrap it up. This goes back to that rabbit hole thing. You start answering in detail, and and then this, and we go down this little channel and this little channel. And before you know it, and I've seen it happen many times, that candidates will spend an inordinate amount of time on the first couple of questions, and then the interviewers don't have time for the remaining questions, or they have to hurry it up. It kind of displays, it displays to the people who are conducting the interview, you be concise. I've told you we've only got 45 minutes. You've got to help us balance it out. And a lot of people doing interviews are a little reluctant to cut you off. It's a little hard sometimes. It's like breathe so I can throw in another question real quick and get you focused on something else. So you as a candidate have a role in managing that time a little bit. Don't be rude. Don't take up all the time like I am right now.
I'm thinking about all of the interviews I've been in and how nervous I've been and how I've just done that and accidentally seemingly manipulated the conversation just because I couldn't stop filling the space. And everybody's in their tight shoes, their dress shoes, and everybody, it's a high pressure situation. So that this is certainly, I think, another indication, and what Megan mentioned earlier, a champion for practicing, for doing mock interviews, and now we have the technology to do that. A person can record themselves on Zoom answering questions and watch it back, similar to an NFL player would watching plays. And I think that this is certainly something that lets us know that we need to practice before going in so we can relax and we don't go round and round with ourselves. In a meaning, we're meaning well, but it's not a good look. So let's finish up with follow-up. And I've seen some interesting follow-ups. One in particular really stood out, and not in a good way, even though I thought it was clever. I saw a candidate come in and interview, and then a week later, a package arrived, and it was quite an elaborate gift for those who had interviewed her. And it surprised them, but again, not in a positive way. So what do we need to do for follow-up in an interview to make a good impression?
I think, and I've been asked this question a lot. I've worked with a couple of people just over the course of the last few months, and that question came up. Well, what should I do once the interview's done? And I said, if first of all, doing nothing is okay. People that conduct the interview probably aren't expecting you. You're not their new best friend. They're not looking for you to come back with anything. But again, back to being polite. It's polite if I've invited you in for an interview for you to come back afterwards and say, I'd just like to thank you very much for the opportunity to interview for the position of X, and look forward to hearing from you soon. Regards, me. And that's about as long as it needs to be. It's not an opportunity to go, I was really glad to interview, thanks. And there was that one question, and really what I meant to say was, or I answered it this way, and probably none of that. This is not a time to introduce new information, to explain away what you did or didn't do in the interview. Just a simple, thank you, standing by, appreciate your effort, think your company does great work, whatever. That's about it. I never have recommended going any further than that with thank yous.
I've never heard anybody say do nothing. That's pretty impressive. Most of the time that's something we don't hear. So I like that.
Holly, I was just going to add real quick. I remember being kind of pleasantly surprised once where, when you have a panel of people interviewing a candidate, we usually go around and introduce ourselves and our role in the institution, just to, as that courtesy, so the interviewee knows who they're talking to. And I've had a couple scenarios where that person was paying attention enough that they sent a group email. I'm a big fan of handwritten notes. Don't get me wrong. That's like my life, is writing thank you notes. I feel like is like 25% of my job. So nice handwritten notes, great. But it really stood out to me that they took time to figure out, not just remember who was in the room, but looking up their email addresses, and they sent an email to everyone who was on the interview panel. So to me, I was just like, they were really paying attention and kind of engaging more in conversation rather than just it being about their presentation. So, how I'm good at stalking people in nice legal ways for gratitude purposes, but organization, has a directory, or you have some way of reaching out personally like that. I just thought it was a nice gesture that they were really engaged.
Yeah, absolutely. And paying attention. That's a nice touch. Well, this is a great way to wrap up and in talking about job interviews. And I feel like now Jerry's a regular. I'm like, what's next? What are we going to talk about next? So do either of you have anything to add before we sign off?
Can I tag up on one thing?
No, I'm just kidding. We're supposed to have fun too. That's one of the core values of Boss Lady Coaching. So
Megan mentioned something very important. And she talked about, what do I bring samples of work? What do I bring to an interview? Is it okay if I do that? That's a tough one to answer, because if people want you to bring something to an interview, they will tell you. And I've been in plenty of interviews, or as an interviewer, where we've asked for samples of work, writing samples, a written article, did something for a public affairs individual. We wanted to see written documents, an article there or two that they produced. I have been in interviews where a candidate walks in and they have this nice big bound glossy, here's the I Love Me book, and it has all this work and stuff. I would just, again, to be polite, thank you, and never look at those, because one of our basic precepts in the federal government, at least, and I think it's true in a lot of larger corporations and companies, I want to treat every candidate the same. And if you give me a big fancy book, but nobody else does, and I end up selecting you as my candidate, you kind of open yourself up for some criticism and potentially legal concerns of, you let this other individual do this. I didn't even know that was an option. And so I would caution people against bringing anything to an interview unless somebody asked. Now, or if you want to have that kind of in your hip pocket, and it seems like, gee, it might be nice if I could show them something quickly, then do that. But you have that on hand. again, you're prepared, and that in itself is fairly impressive. So, okay, let me walk out of that rabbit hole.
No, that's great advice. And I think in that situation, based on what we talked about, it's really contextual. So if you showed it to them, you could take it back with you and not leave it with them and cause any concern there legally. So that's a great point. Thank you so much, Jerry, for joining us again and for providing such great information, helpful information about job interviews.
Always have fun doing this. Thanks for inviting me.
And Megan, it's great to see you, and I'm excited for the future when one day we'll do great boss lady coaching things together in public. And we have a lot of new authors in our midst, and we have a lot of exciting interviews coming up with small business owners. So I'm just going to tease that a little bit, but it was great to see you too.
Likewise, always wonderful to spend time together. Thanks for setting this up, and thank you, Jerry. Some awesome tips and definitely great advice for all of us.
Well, ladies, you do a great job, and you just provide such just wonderful things for the community. I appreciate on behalf of the community. I appreciate all you're doing out there.
Thanks, Jerry. And if you're watching or listening, we're on iTunes, Boss Lady Coaching Podcast. We're also on SoundCloud. You can find us on Facebook at Boss Lady Coaching, online at BeTheBossCoaching.com. And you can also find us on Instagram at Boss Lady Coaching. And we'll see you all next time. Be well.